In this lecture, I'm going to describe the sensory and motor pathways in the spinal cord. At the end of this lecture, I want you to be able to describe both the motor pathways and the sensory pathways, so you have a very good understanding of these pathways. I also would like you to know the difference between the various ganglia in the body and be able to tell the difference histologically when you see images of these structures. Well, let's just make sure that we're aware of the autonomic nervous system again before we then try to put all this together and try to describe the structure of the spinal cord in more detail and show the pathways of all these sensory and motor neurons, somatic motor and also visceral motor neurons. Well, just recall that there are a number of functional divisions of the autonomic nervous system. There is the efferent innervation to smooth muscle we're unaware of. Efferent innervation means it's exiting the spinal cord or the brain. They're visceral motor neurons. They're causing contraction of smooth muscle, components of cardiac muscle, and also the contraction of muscle around glands to increase or decrease secretion. They're going to be divided into two components, the sympathetic components and the parasympathetic components. And as I mentioned earlier, they have opposite effects. But it's worth remembering also that when we see these neurons travelling to their destinations, they are also accompanied by sensory neurons that are taking information back from the viscera. Now, it's important also to understand that when I described the ventral horn neuron that was stimulated by that pyramidal cell very early on in the lecture, that ventral horn cell was only the one cell needed to innervate skeletal muscle. The axon of that ventral horn cell travelled all the way out of the ventral horn, all the way down to innervate the skeletal muscle that it's designed and joined on to innervate. Could be all the way down to the muscles in your toe. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, in the case of the need to innervate the smooth muscle and glands, etc., that I've mentioned, there are two neurons involved. Neurons we call preganglionic and neurons we call postganglionic. And I'll describe that in more detail as we go through. But it is an important point. Somatic motor neurons are only one neuron, whereas the autonomic neurons require two neurons. So let's now have a look at the arrangement and the location of the motor and sensory neurons in the spinal cord. So now it's important for us to make sure we know clearly the locations of sensory and motor neurons. On this diagram, you can see the grey matter and the white matter of the spinal cord. So just get used to this diagram and just have a little view of what sort of information it's going to illustrate. I want you to first concentrate on the left-hand part of the figure, the bit that talks about somatic reflexes. And we'll talk about the visceral reflexes later on. Picture the peripheral nerve on the outside, and also picture the ventral horn here in the grey matter. And now, have a look at the ventral horn. It actually passes, a branch passes from the spinal cord. It's called the ventral root. And if you look up top at the dorsal horn, you can see that there's also a dorsal root. And these combine together to form the peripheral nerve. Now, the ventral horn, if you look very carefully, houses the cell body of the motor neuron, the somatic motor neuron. And that neuron has an axon that passes out of the ventral root, travels down the peripheral nerve and innervates the muscle. In this case, it's innervating a finger muscle in response to a finger prick. So that really summarises the location of a somatic motor neuron, an efferent neuron, exiting the spinal cord. And notice there's only one neuron involved. Now, picture also on this image the right-hand side, the visceral reflex. And we'll describe now the somatic efferent visceral neuron pathway, the autonomic pathway, motor neurons that are going to innervate smooth muscle and components that we're not conscious about. And again, remember that I said 2 neurons were involved. Well, remember that I described the lateral horn when we looked at the section through the spinal cord before. So we've labelled it here on this diagram. Make sure you can recognise that lateral horn. And in that lateral horn is going to be the very first neuron, neuron number 1. And it's called a preganglionic neuron. Preganglionic because it travels to a ganglion, a group of cell bodies, and interacts with the second order neuron, the postganglionic neuron. And in this case, if you look very carefully, you can see the axon in the diagram moving its way out of the ventral root as well, travelling out of the spinal cord, and it travels to this structure labelled called a prevertebral ganglion. This prevertebral ganglion is really just outside the spinal cord, and I'll talk about this in more detail later on. Well, that's where the postganglionic neuron is located, and it then travels, or its axon then travels and innervates the smooth muscle. So it's important now that you understand this 2 neuron pathway to do with the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic or parasympathetic follows the same sort of pathway. It's just that, as we'll see later on, the location of the ganglion that houses the postganglionic neuron is located in a different place, whether it's sympathetic or whether it's parasympathetic. And there's a paraventral or paravertebral ganglion shown there. It doesn't matter at this stage what the difference between these 2 ganglia are. Well, let's have a look now at sensory neurons. Where are they located? Have a look again at the peripheral nerve. Familiarise yourself again on the somatic reflex side of this diagram, and have a look at the dorsal root ganglion labelled there. That is where the cell body of the sensory neuron is located. And notice its axon travels from the periphery, from the fingertip, picking up the sensation of pain probably, that from the finger prick. And that pain travels along the axon into the dorsal root ganglion and travels further on past the cell body of that sensory neuron into the dorsal root and into the dorsal horn. And there it can interact to the motor neuron in the ventral horn by a simple interneuron and create the reflex arc. So when you pick your finger, sensory information goes in through the dorsal root via the sensory neuron, interacts very quickly with the motor neuron from the ventral horn, and then that motor neuron innervates skeletal muscles to remove your finger. Well, let's have a look at the visceral sensory neurons. Only one neuron is involved in this situation. Again, the dorsal root ganglion, shown here, houses sensory neurons. All sensory neurons are housed in these dorsal root ganglia, or in some ganglia in the head to do with sensory neurons going in with cranial nerves. And have a look at the visceral sensory neuron. It's detecting information about perhaps the contraction of the wall of the gut and carrying that information all the way in through the ganglia. It doesn't synapse with any neuron there, all the way in through the dorsal root ganglion and then through the dorsal root, just like any other sensory or somatic sensory neuron. That's the pathway then of the visceral sensory neuron. Now, when you look at ganglia, it's important that you understand how to differentiate from a dorsal root ganglia and another type of ganglia we'll see in a moment. This is the dorsal root ganglion, and what you see there are cell bodies, somas, of the sensory neuron. They're large because, as I've explained before, their axons project a long way to the periphery and often a long way into the central nervous system. I just showed you the reflex arc, but of course, when you prick your finger, you don't just move your finger away very quickly because of the reflex arc. You remember it. You feel the pain. And that's because that sensory neuron also communicates with other neurons in the spinal cord and above in the brain. So it's a large cell. It's got a large length of axon to maintain. Now, what you see wrapped around these ganglion cells are other small cells. These are called satellite cells. And recall that these ganglion cells, these sensory neurons, don't have a dendritic tree. They just have a bipolar or a pseudo-unipolar type arrangement coming out and forming the two axonal branches. So when you look at sections of the dorsal root ganglion or sensory ganglion, you often see satellite cells cluttered nicely around each of these sensory neuron cell bodies because they can fit nicely around and support these ganglion cells. Later on, we'll see that the ganglia associated with the autonomic motor nerves don't have satellite cells wrapped all the way around them because of the dendritic trees that prevent that from happening. And the big blob of material in the middle of this section are the axons of these sensory neurons. Well, it's now important to really have a look at the division of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division. In this diagram, it looks rather complicated, but it's just a simple story that I want to try and explain. And that is, let's first of all look at the sympathetic division. The sympathetic division comes from only certain spinal cord segments. They come from thoracic and lumbar areas. The thoracolumbar components make up the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And those thoracolumbar preganglionic neurons pass to ganglia just outside the spinal cord. You can see them labelled there in a long chain running down next to the spinal cord, a chain of ganglia. You can see little blue coloured neurons exiting the thorax and the lumbar region of the spinal cord. These represent the preganglionic sympathetic neurons, and they travel into this paravertebral or prevertebral chain of ganglia, or other little ganglia you see in circles there, and then the second order neuron, or the postganglionic neuron, then passes to the tissue where it does its activity, where it innervates the smooth muscle or whatever the target tissue is. Parasympathetic division is different. Neurons, the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division of the nervous system, exit from the cranium or from the sacral region, craniosacral. They don't exit the spinal cord at any other location. And these preganglionic neurons travel a long way, some distance, out into the organs, the viscera, and there they locate the postganglionic neurons. And those postganglionic neurons are located very close to the organ in which the postganglionic neuron is then going to innervate. So, in simple summary, the sympathetic preganglionic neurons are short, but the postsympathetic neurons are long. In the case of the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic fibres are very long because they contact ganglion and postganglionic cells in those ganglia very close to the organ in which they are going to innervate. Sometimes the transmitters used vary in each of these types of neurons. Some can use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. Some can use adrenaline, and therefore they're often referred to as being cholinergic and adrenergic neurons. And I only say that because I might use that term in later lectures. Well, on this diagram here, it's a picture or an image of one of these postsynaptic neurons in a paravertebral ganglia or part of the sympathetic ganglia. And there, you don't see a lot of satellite cells around the cell bodies. And that is because, as I explained before, these neurons have a dendritic tree communicating with preganglionic neurons. And because of that vast dendritic tree, these satellite cells cannot pack around as much as they do in a sensory or a dorsal root ganglion. Here's an example of a parasympathetic autonomic ganglion. Remember, I said they're located out near the viscera, so that the postganglionic neuron travels a very short distance to the target tissue. And they're very hard to see sometimes. They're very tiny. This is a section in the tongue. And you see a neuron, rather a large structure, surrounded by a few satellite cells embedded in the connective tissue areas of the tongue. Those postsynaptic neurons, the cell bodies you see labelled there, are going to travel a short distance and innervate glands in the tongue. Glands in the tongue are shown here. Serous secreting glands that secrete materials that flush out fluid away from our taste buds so that we can continually taste different tastes. It's all controlled by secretion of these serous glands, all controlled by these short postganglionic neurons travelling from postganglionic areas out in the periphery. Well, finally, let me just show you a picture of the wall of the gut. You see on the left-hand side, on the very top dark pink area, that's part of the muscle wall of the gut. The material down below represents large folds in the gut, and finally the gut mucosa. We'll cover that in more detail when we talk about the gut in a later lecture. But if you look very careful in the middle of the wall of that muscle, the muscularis externa, you can see tiny little ganglion cells. They represent the enteric ganglia, that independent network of nerve cells that control the contraction of that muscularis externa muscle area, as well as another muscle layer you can barely see there called the muscularis mucosa. But again, I will talk to you in more detail about that when we look at the digestive system in a later lecture. So in summary, it is important for you to be able to describe the motor pathways, both the somatic motor pathways and the visceral motor pathways. And also be able to recognise in the spinal cord what structural components those pathways relate to. Similarly, you should know the sensory pathways, both the somatic sensory and the visceral sensory pathways. And again, also be able to locate within the spinal cord where those pathways travel and what structural components in the spinal cord relate to those sensory pathways. It's very important that you understand the functional significance of ganglia and also their structures, and be able to differentiate between a sensory ganglion or a dorsal root ganglion and ganglia belonging to the sympathetic components of the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic components of the autonomic nervous system. So thank you for listening to this lecture.